Hello, I'm Dominic Morris, head of the senior living team at Gowling WLG. Today in our senior living podcast series, I'm delighted to be joined by Sally Ireland, head of regulation and compliance at ARCO, the Associated Retirement Communities Operators. Hi, Sally.
Hi.
Hi. So let's jump straight in if we can. For those less familiar with the sector and ARCO, are you able to tell us a little bit about what ARCO does?
Yes, so ARCO's been around for about 8 years now, and it has really a dual purpose. So firstly, it's a trade association in the classic sense. It brings the sector together and acts as the voice of the sector to government and other stakeholders. And secondly, it also sets standards for the sector. So we have a program of self-regulation and assessments, which assess members against the Consumer Code, which is our code for members, which sets out how they should operate and how they should protect consumers.
Can you tell us a bit about your membership? What sort of bodies are members of ARCO?
Yeah, so there's we've got 30 members at the moment, plus a number who want to join the sector and have joined us as accelerators. Our membership is quite broad. It goes across both the affordable provision, which is actually the majority of provision in this sector. So some of the big housing associations that you'll be aware of and not-for-profit operators of housing with care. And then we also have the for-profit providers. Some of the more luxury operators that you would also have heard of. So we do have quite a broad membership, but one of the nice things is that because most of our members aren't in competition with each other yet, we have a very good collegiate spirit between members, and people are very happy to share best practice with each other and work together to achieve common goals. So it works well.
Great. And you personally, I think you're a barrister by trade, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah. So I have a background in public law and social care law. So two aspects of which are really useful in this role. So the first thing that I've done quite a lot of is legislative drafting, which is pretty dry, but it does give you a good insight into law reforms and how they should work. And the other thing is that I have a background in representing older and disabled people in disputes around their care and public authorities' duties towards them. So that obviously gives me an insight into the residents who will be living in housing with care and their needs from my own experience.
So what's on your desk typically, your daily job, as it were?
Yeah, so it has two main aspects. So one is the law reform work. So we're very active at the moment in trying to bring about the changes that we think that we need to grow the sector sustainably in terms of changing the law in a number of areas and also increasing the amount of regulation for the sector. And then the other side of it is setting the standards for members. So as I said, we have the Consumer Code and we assess members against it. So we have a program of regular assessments and work with members to achieve compliance in different areas. So I oversee that work as well.
Fantastic. So a very varied brief.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I think quite a good way for people to sort of understand the work that ARCO is doing and indeed what the priorities are for the wider housing with care sector is to sort of look at your Vision 2030.
Yep.
Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Vision 2030 is articulating the ambition to have 250,000 people living in housing with care settings by 2030. It's only 9 years away now, I've realised, talking to you today. We haven't got long to achieve this. So we have about 75,000 at the moment. So we're looking at a really substantial expansion of the sector to bring it more in line with, other countries like Australia and New Zealand, for example, where, retirement communities are very successful and lots of people live in them. So Vision 2030 sets out 10 areas which need work and attention to make that vision a reality. So that is everything from enhanced health and well-being, creating the evidence base to show the benefits of housing with care, looking at tenure, how people own their property and how we can better set out the rights and responsibilities of residents and operators, looking at workforce and making sure there is a a sustainable and suitably skilled workforce for these settings, and funding as well. So there's lots and lots of different areas in the Vision 2030. I think the key one now for the next, say, 12 to 24 months is legal reform and policy reform, and the proposals that we're putting forward to government and getting political support for, that we think are needed to grow the sector sustainably.
Okay. So if we could maybe look a little bit more about how ARCO is sort of, I guess, leading the charge for the sector in terms of influencing policy. I mean, from my perspective, I guess the housing with care as sort of an operational business, effectively.
Yeah.
It is impacted by probably so many sort of different strands of government, and how are you going about sort of grappling with that?
So what we're calling for is a housing with care task force, and the idea for a task force comes from exactly that, you know, this is housing with care is something which goes across different government departments. So the main departments that we deal with are the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, which obviously has the housing brief, and the Department for Health and Social Care, which has the social care brief. And obviously, you know, for our members, both are important. But there are also other departments. So, for example, BEIS, which looks after consumer regulation, the Treasury, obviously always important in terms of funding, and others. So what we're asking for is a cross-government task force to look at what the levers are that need to be pulled, as it were, in order to free the sector to expand further. You know, and the three that we've really identified are sector-specific legislation, including attention given to leasehold reform, clarity in the planning system, and then in the affordable side of the sector, looking at the funding options so that the model can remain accessible to older people who perhaps haven't accumulated housing wealth in their life.
Okay, with a government that's got quite a lot on its plate at the moment, what sort of traction are you getting?
Yeah, I mean, we've you know, we've got sort of cross-party support for this now, and we you know, we are being well heard in government. You know, we haven't got the task force running yet, but we are hoping that will happen. We are also you know, working with government in a number of areas, and actually during the pandemic, I think we've worked quite closely with, you know, the Department of Health and Social Care, for example, on things like you know, care guidance, the needs of our sector, infection control, you know, how to get vaccination to our residents, and all those things. So I think it's actually really shown government the value of that the sector brings, and established, you know, closer working relationships, which we hope will continue, you know, post-pandemic.
Yeah, it'd be good to come on and talk a little about those COVID learnings in a bit, actually.
Yeah.
So housing with care, retirement communities, the list of labels goes on and on. I think one of the struggles for people looking at the sector, be they sort of investors, operators, or indeed the sort of general public, your potential residents and purchasers, is understanding the products they're getting.
Yeah.
And I think you have a sort of concept of living options for older people. And if we have on the one hand sort of retirement housing, sort of downsizer models, on the other hand, care homes, nursing homes, housing with care, retirement communities sort of sits in that middle space.
Yep.
How do you see and sort of deal with that interface?
Yeah, I mean, there's two aspects to this question, really. I mean, one is about the definition, and one is, you know, where are the gaps in provision. So on the definition, it's no doubt a difficult and thorny issue because it is quite a broad category at the moment. As ARCO, we have a definition in the Consumer Code of what you have to offer to be an ARCO member, the core services that you have to offer. You know, so your community has to be primarily for older people. You have to have 24-hour staffing, communal facilities and a social program, offer meals and domestic services, and make personal care available. And all that helps to differentiate our members from the more traditional retirement housing sector, where, you know, you have your age-specific housing, you might have a lounge, you don't have a great deal else in terms of communal facilities and services. But you know, I think the need for a legal definition, you know, is really clear now, both in planning terms, you know, where we don't have a specific planning category for housing with care, and that can create some issues. But also in lots of other areas where the sector can either be overlooked or just lumped in with general housing, when actually, it's a very different kind of business. This is primarily a service-based business. So yeah, we are considering options for better definition of the sector. And in terms of the relationship with other types of provision, I think care homes, everybody knows what a care home is, whereas not everybody knows what housing with care is, or a retirement community. What we see now is that some care home operators are moving towards the more high needs acute model of provision, and away from that kind of more traditional just residential care model. And we think that's the right thing, because actually, where the gap arose is in that lower needs category, from the 90s onwards, really, where the kind of emphasis on community care allowed people to stay in their own homes for longer, which can be great if it goes well, but obviously there can also be problems, both in terms of people staying in unsuitable housing. For example, the Centre for Ageing Better have done really good reports on that. The number of older people who are still living in unsuitable housing, which can be, damp, just can't meet their mobility needs and so forth. And then also problems with provision of housing of care for people in their own home. So if you live in a rural area, for example, it can be really difficult to set up a care package that's going to meet your needs. There's also, well-known problems with funding for people who can't afford to pay for their own care and need local authority help. So that community care model can't really fill the gap, and has led to too many people being sent into care homes, when that's perhaps not the best option for them. So what we're doing is providing another option where people can have their needs met, but that also they can have the autonomy and independence of staying in their own home.
That was very neatly put.
Yeah.
Thanks. So sort of, I guess, leading on from that, there are a lot of people sort of inquiring, looking to participate in the sector, be they sort of prospective operators, investors, funders. What would you say are some of the key things that they need to have on their radar when they're making those decisions?
We've seen really renewed interest in the sector probably since the onset of the pandemic, and I think that's not just due to COVID-19's impact on social care provision, but also on lots of other areas as well, and operators of perhaps care homes or even hoteliers thinking about what else they could offer and what other sectors they could enter. I think the key thing is that this is a long-term operational business, and while there is obviously an important development side to things, that it's not a pure house builder model. So are you wanting to be in it for the long run, running this community, and do you want to provide services and a community to these residents, because that's the most important part of the business. So people need to think about that carefully. The other thing is what is your market? So we talked about the types of provision that are out there. 2/3 is in the affordable sector. There's a smaller but well-established luxury or high-end market, particularly in south of England. Mid-market is where the gap is. So that's an important thing to look at. But then obviously you've got to make sure that what you're offering is genuinely affordable, and not just at point of purchase, but throughout the older person's life. So we know that older people, they like to have certainty around the affordability of where they're moving, so that they can age in place and not have to risk moving again. And the third thing is, how are you going to compete, not so much with other retirement community operators, but with the older person's own home, because, really what you've got to persuade them to do is downsize. So, how are you making it easy for them to move in to the community? Some people thinking about moving into a retirement community may not have bought a property for 40 years, and may have just owned a freehold house or a bungalow for all that time. And you might be presenting them with a fairly complex proposition with different fees and charges. How are you going to cut through all that so that they understand the offer and are confident that it's going to work for them And what's your pull factor going to be? You know, is it, you know, your studying leisure facilities, your gardens, your social program? We often find that a lot of marketing works by word of mouth in this sector. So people who are already living in the community bring their friends to see it, and you know, their friends think it's amazing, and then obviously they start looking. And you know, one of the films that we show sometimes at events is from the Australian sector, where a new operator establishing itself in a town, they went out and reached out to the older people, went along to the local bowls club and befriended people and started talking about it. So you've got to be quite innovative with your marketing, I think.
I'd agree with all of that. And I think the profile and the benefits that housing with care can provide has been sort of massively demonstrated, to be honest, with the challenges of the last year with dealing with the COVID pandemic, and the response of the sector to it. Are you able to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's obviously, you know, been massively challenging for this sector as for many others, and you know, our residents are vulnerable at the end of the day. The ARCO's work changed a lot, you know, in the last year, and we've been offering a lot of support to members around COVID, you know, and bringing them together to share their best practice, their policies, and their procedures. You know, working with government on things like PPE, you know, and infection control. So, you know, it's been very important. I think the last year or so has really shown the benefits of this model, because you know, you've got self-contained accommodation where just by its nature it's easier to control the spread of the virus and people to isolate, but combined with support, you know, and the services that our members have been able to offer their residents, so you know, delivering meals to the door, you know, video communication, just things to enhance their well-beings, you know, balcony exercise programs. I mean, lots of different things. And I think in your last podcast, Nick Sanderson of Audi, our chair, mentioned, you know, the value that that's had, not just to residents, but also their families who, you know, may be living at some distance and desperately worried about their older relatives. And you know, if they're in a retirement community, that somebody is going to be looking out for them. I think that's incredibly valuable. We've also seen, you know, a spike in demand of people wanting to move into retirement communities, and some of them managed to move in, you know, even during the pandemic. So the housing market has largely kept moving throughout. So we've adapted by, you know, helping our members with resources to allow for sales and marketing to take place purely remotely. Obviously, a lot of the older materials are based around visits and documents you should give to consumers on a visit. And so we've had to, you know, adapt to the fact that's going to be done digitally largely, and that may continue after the pandemic as well. So I think it's been challenging, but I think that, you know, our members have you know, worked very hard to keep their residents safe and to continue to offer support.
I think living in these communities where their sort of raison d'etre is really to promote the well-being and independent lifestyle of their residents, and you know, to literally they are focused on looking after their residents, as opposed to sort of living out in the wider community and being dependent on sort of wider social support. It is very clearly, it's reaping great rewards for those that are able to do it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, it just means that you're not going to get overlooked or have to put your hand up for help, really, that, you know, may be challenging to some older people who have been living fairly isolated lives. And I think it's really shone a spotlight on that isolation that is experienced, unfortunately, by a lot of older people in the community. You know, and there is an alternative out there, you know, and at all levels. You don't have to be wealthy and downsizing from a big house to move into a retirement community.
So I think between us, we're agreed that housing with care is a very good thing. So with your legal hat on, what are the sort of legal reforms that you're working on, looking to promote to help encourage the growth of the sector?
Yep. So the three main areas that we're concentrating on in the Housing with Care task force are sector-specific legislation and regulation, and which includes leasehold reform. And so that's an area that I personally do a lot of work on. And this is really about that definitional question that we were talking about, but also, you know, what is the specific regulation that is needed for our sector, you know, that will provide a greater level of legal certainty to allow it to grow. So whether that be on event fees, whether that be making sure that the broader leasehold reform agenda doesn't sweep up this sector along with ordinary leasehold housing and make inappropriate reforms for us. So, common hold, for example, which may work really, really well in an ordinary block of flats, for people to, come together in a common hold company and manage their properties. In this sector, the operator resident relationship is really, really important. And, we've even had residents writing saying we don't want common hold. The whole point of moving here was so we wouldn't have to worry about things like fixing it, heating or whatever it is. So I think, we're looking for some specific treatment there. Planning, where again, we need more sector specific treatment, and whether that be a specific use class for the sector or just a recognition of the social benefits that come with building housing with care. So, the King's Fund and University of York have done a really good report recently looking at how housing with care reduces reliance on NHS services and also obviously provides specific mental and physical health benefits to older people themselves living there. I think that there can be a perception amongst planners that, we don't want a retirement community being built here because it will cause extra pressure on our NHS services in the local area, for example, or, it will cause a burden rather than a benefit, as it were. And, there's obviously that famous case recently about it not being a vibrant choice for town centres. Whereas we would say, obviously, what you're doing is you're moving in people who, have lots of time to spend, lots of social capital of their own, and lots of potentially disposable income to spend in your town or your area, and that also you're actually providing health benefits to people, which mean that there's likely to be less reliance on the local NHS. So there's a lot of misunderstandings there. And the final thing is about funding. So on the affordable side of the sector, it's just making sure that the funding framework is right, so that the affordable sector remains accessible to people at all income levels, and so that everyone can move into a housing with care community and they have that chance.
So there's a lot of material there. That's a really good synopsis. I think it's fair to say, I mean, the model works now within the legal framework that we have at the moment.
Yep.
But with the sort of the winds of change of landlord and tenant reform that the government's promising, and reform in other areas, as you say, it's almost a defensive position to make sure that housing with care is not caught up with unintended consequences from that wider reform, as well as you say, promoting its own agenda to help really see a sea change in growth, I think, for the sector.
Absolutely. I mean, leasehold, was obviously never designed with this sort of community in mind, and there is something very logical about using a 175-year lease for somebody's residence in a retirement community they might live in for 10 or 20 years, and all the other sort of services that the community is providing, which don't really have anything to do with the property per se. It's it's a strange fit, and people have made it work, and the sector's made it work, and it's worked well. But I think if leasehold reform takes things in a certain direction, the sector will need to look at other models of tenure and whether there's anything else that we should be promoting to government, and obviously looking comparatively at other jurisdictions where there is more retirement community provision, and what are the things that they're using that we could look at and model our own sector specific legislation on. So that's definitely something we're considering for the future.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. Before we sort of finish off, I think one of the things that I find really striking and sort of, I guess, very positive is the consensus from various sort of, I guess, politically and from just generally sort of various parts of society. I guess this consensus of the benefits and the advantages of housing with care as a model. And I think you've recently published your grey paper, as you call it, on housing with care. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Housing with Care Grey Paper is a collection of essays, writings by figures from really across the political spectrum, and talking about from quite a personal perspective, often about their own experience of relatives who perhaps have developed needs, or might have lived in a retirement community, or that wasn't an option for them, and how it could have improved their lives. And I think that you are right in that it's one of the I've worked in a number of policy areas in my career, and this is one area that is genuinely cross-party. It is supported across the political spectrum, and because the social benefits are clear to see for all, but also that personally, we've all had perhaps an elderly relative who's developed care needs, or we've known somebody who's needed to go perhaps into a care home, or has had a fall at home, and perhaps when we would have liked to have seen other options for them. And I think that that's led to a lot of commitment to this sector from a range of different people who perhaps deriving from their own personal experience. And when you go to retirement communities, and obviously one of the sad things about the pandemic is that we haven't been able to go into our members' retirement communities for over a year now, and but when you do go, you do see the benefits of this provision in terms of people's well-being, and you can you can imagine that you would like your older relatives to consider that move. So I would encourage everyone to visit them. We do have quite a busy programme usually of taking MPs to see their retirement communities in their constituencies. Obviously that's been on hold, but that's one of the things we're really looking forward again to doing once the pandemic eases.
Yeah, that's great. I think that the more and more of these schemes there are, the more and more people can actually see what it's like. It will sort of grow its own momentum. Well, that has been a really interesting walk through the work of ARCO and your work within ARCO. It looks as though you've got an absolutely packed agenda for the next few years. Yep. Is there anything sort of for those people who are interested in finding out more about ARCO that you'd like to flag?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, one is we haven't had time to talk about our partnership program. So we have a number of commercial partners, an advisory council, and an affiliate network, and so lots of different kinds of organisations on there, including Gowling, and contributing their expertise to the sector. So lots of opportunities to get involved there. And for those considering entering the sector as an operator, we have an accelerator program which allows you to join ARCO without becoming a full member, but to get access to expertise, talk to our existing members, and hopefully decide if it's the right thing for you, and then get the support from us if you do want to go ahead with launching your business. So I think there's lots of opportunities. We've got a conference which we are hoping to do in person, which will be on the 3rd and 4th of November of this year. But in the meantime, just get in touch with us and we'll be happy to help.
Fantastic. Well, it's been really interesting to talk to you about the great work you're doing at ARCO, and just like to thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Dominic. It's been great.